So welcome to our Spring 2021 workshop, Large Projects, Large Teams, Benefits, Drawbacks, and Strategies for Project Management and Collaboration, hosted by the Digital Humanities Initiative at the University of Illinois at Chicago. The DHI at UIC was initially funded by a University of Illinois presidential grant to celebrate the impact of the arts and the humanities, and is a collaboration between the Institute for the Humanities and the University Library. The DHI hosts events throughout the year, including workshops like this one, as well as an annual conference. You can find out more about the DHI and our upcoming events by visiting our website at dhi.uic.edu. So before I talk a little bit about our program today, I'd like to introduce the other co-director of the DHI, Janet Spacino.
Thank you, Carla. First, I'd like to thank everyone at the Institute for the Humanities for their hard work pulling together both the fall workshop and our earlier spring workshop, along with this workshop, in particular Carla and all the work she's done. So I'm the digital publishing librarian at the UIC Library, and I'm the co-director of the Digital Humanities Initiative. My main responsibilities include managing the library's open access journal program and supporting online digital projects. So I'm excited today to be joined by these two digital humanities projects, the Amy Lowell Letters Project and the Backwards River Project. I'll now turn it back over to Carla.
Thanks, Janet. So today's event is meant to offer 2 points of view of what it's like to work on a DH project with a lot of moving parts, including how teams navigate and manage challenges related to ambitious projects, and how these challenges might be different for faculty grad student teams than, say, a smaller project that involves just faculty or just grad students. Our presenters will offer pragmatic, practical advice and strategies to those who are or will soon be collaborating on such a project. We're immensely grateful to the two project teams that are here with us today, the Amy Lowell Letters Project and Freshwater Lab, who created the Backward River, for generously agreeing to give us their time in this virtual format, despite what they, like all of us, are no doubtedly feeling 14 months into this protracted and exhausting pandemic. We have continued to learn, live, and even thrive, thanks to scholars, educators, artists, and digital humanists like the ones you're going to meet today. So thanks to all of you for being here. Seriously. So I know we're all more than accustomed to Zoom webinars by now, but as a reminder, please enter your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, not the chat, and Janet or I will read them aloud. Each team will talk about their project for about 20 minutes, after which we'll immediately begin taking questions. So let's go ahead and start the first session. So I'm super excited to introduce our first Digital Humanities Project team, not just because their project is interesting, but also because as a poet, I get super stoked whenever poetry and digital humanities collide. The Amy Lowell Letters Project, an open access digital scholarly edition of the letters of American poet, editor, and critic Amy Lowell, is based at the Center for Textual Studies and Digital Humanities and the Department of English at Loyola University Chicago. The project is directed and edited by Dr. Melissa Bradshaw, Senior Lecturer in the Department of English, and the members of her team that are here with her today are Danielle Richards, Project Manager and PhD candidate, Kiamara Homan, Encoder and PhD candidate, and Caroline McCraw, Project Manager and PhD student at University of Wisconsin-Madison. So I don't want to say too much about about your project, Melissa, because obviously you'll describe it best. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to you and your team.
All right, thank you. It's so nice to be here. Thank you for having me. I am going to share my screen and get started. Okay, can everybody see that? Okay, great. Digital archives have been a game changer for those of us involved in feminist literary criticism. Previously, scholarship and teaching on all but a few token canonical women authors, such as Virginia Woolf or Jane Austen, has been difficult because you've needed to be able to get to archives or rely on limited access to reprints and editions still in print. So the field of digital humanities has not only made it possible to elevate marginalized histories and voices, but it's made it a priority. Digital scholarly archives such as Women Writers Online and the Orlando Project have made huge amounts of primary and secondary documents related to out-of-print and mostly forgotten women authors widely accessible, usable, and searchable. Single author digital archives like the Marianne Moore Digital Archive, which is digitizing hundreds of scrapbooks and poetry notebooks kept by the enigmatic poet, offer new perspectives on more well-known women authors by digitizing manuscript drafts and ephemera otherwise unseen by the general public. So we're a little bit in between. Lowell is what we like to call hidden in plain sight. Most people know about her, but they don't really know much about her. But I wanted to begin by introducing my project team. So I'm the project director, and I have with me here today Danielle Richards, Caroline McCraw, and Kiamara Homan, who you will hear from later. But we also have a group of graduate students, former and continuing, who have been part of this. Erica Christie, Chowlin Sun, Zachary Stella, Samantha Lepak, Prakriti Maniar, Ren Romero, Orion Elrod, who's actually an undergraduate student working with us, and Anthony Shoplick. And I wanted to take a moment to offer gratitude for the institutions that have supported this work along the way. Of course, the Textual Studies and Digital Humanities Center at Loyola, Loyola University's Office of Research Services, the Newberry Library, the Modernist Studies Association, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And we are so proud and happy that they have signed on to help us with this work. Okay, Lowell. At the time of her death, Amy Lowell, in 1925, Amy Lowell was one of the most celebrated, sought after, and thought about authors in America. Her books, both poetry and literary criticism, were bestsellers, and her tempestuous lectures and readings drew crowds of thousands and fueled countless newspaper reports. She published prodigiously during her 15-year career, so she was really only working from 1910 to 1925. She published 6 volumes of poetry. 3 more were published posthumously. 2 volumes of literary criticism, a 2-volume biography of John Keats, and countless articles and reviews. Her poetry volume, What's O'Clock, was in press at the time of her death, and that won the 1926 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. Okay, now, I don't want to spend too much time with Ezra Pound, but he is an important part of the story that we mostly know about Lowell. Early in her career, fellow American poet Ezra Pound included one of her poems, In a Garden, in his influential 1914 Des Imagistes anthology, which was actually, as you can see here, part of a little magazine called The Glebe. The two soon had a falling out over Lowell's plans to aggressively market imagism, which is the loosely organized poetic style that brought them together. Lowell wanted to publish an annual Imagist anthology with a major commercial press, and she did. Some Imagist Poets, 1915, 1916, 1917, was published by Houghton Mifflin. It was edited by Lowell, and it featured poems by H.D., Hilda Doolittle, and D.H. Lawrence, among others. There were 6 in that initial team. These books turned Imagism into a full-blown poetic movement. Lowell promoted the anthologies in lecture tours where she schooled overcapacity crowds across America in how to read and appreciate imagism, free verse, and experimental poetry more generally. For many Americans of her era, she was the face of modern poetry. And I like these clips. These are from 9 boxes of unprocessed materials at Harvard's Houghton Library, scrapbooks, because somebody of Lowell's stature would have hired a clipping service to put together her press clippings. These clippings give you a sense of how big she was and how she was kind of an influencer. I also like that she gets that Chicago's the best place, even though she's a Boston-based poet. Unfortunately, Lowell's critical reputation suffered in the years following her death, primarily because her successes in marketing imagism left her vulnerable to charges. She was less a poet than a propagandist. Only portions of the lively correspondence that documents her centrality to modern poetry have been published, and only in connection with other figures. No representative collection of her letters exists, even though, according to the librarians at Harvard University's Houghton Library, where her papers are collected, hers is one of the most accessed collections in the library because she corresponded with virtually all the most prominent writers and publishers of her time. Lowell's letters are scholarly, newsy, practical. They're full of candor, warmth, and scorn. They show the depth of her investment in the new poetry movement, in the growth and success of the poets writing it, and in the little magazines publishing it. They reveal as well all the roles she played as a poet, editor, critic, and de facto literary agent. She was involved in everything from designing book covers to writing ad copy, advising marketing plans, and negotiating royalties. These letters show her in conversation with the biggest names of American and European poetry at this time: William Carlos Williams, Wallace Stevens, Marianne Moore, you name it, they're there. But they also show her in equally impassioned conversations with once prominent literary figures less well known today. And perhaps most importantly, they reveal the depth and complexity of her relationships with the behind-the-scene players whose roles in establishing what we now consider the modern poetry canon are usually underrepresented or overlooked. Editors of both little magazines and popular weeklies, heads of publishing houses, newspaper columnists, translators, literature professors, and booksellers. So I have long wanted to publish an edition of Lowell's letters, but while I have decades of experience working with her archive, I am relatively new to the digital humanities. I followed it from the side for years, but I started training myself in digital scholarship 3 years ago when supportive comments and reviewers of an application for an NEH fellowship that I didn't get suggested that a digital edition of Lowell's letters would be more useful and more likely to get funded than the traditional codex I had planned. So in spring 2019, I used some startup funds from Loyola's Office of Research Services, and I took a semester-long course through Texas A&M's Programming for the Humanist program, which I highly recommend, called Digital Editions Start to Finish. And that's where I learned the basics of the Textual Encoding Initiative. Then I won a scholarship from the Modernist Studies Association to attend the Digital Humanities Summer Institute at the University of Victoria in June of 2019. And I took a week-long intensive course in encoding text using TEI. I reconceptualized my edition of Lowell's letters as a digital scholarly edition, and I had it accepted as a project of Loyola Center for Textual Studies and Digital Humanities. But what made this happen and why we're here today is that Liz Hopwood, who I know has been a speaker in a previous workshop, she's the director of Loyola's Center for Textual Studies and Digital Humanities. She took a chance on me and invited me, I felt out of the blue, to teach a graduate practicum in the fall of 2019 with digital humanities and English graduate students. So in this practicum, I covered the content students needed to be intellectually invested in the project. I taught them modernist poetry, periodical studies, editorial theory, and the students wrote proposals outlining their goals for the project and the discrete skills they could bring to it. So together we conceptualized what ALLP would look like. We even decided to call it ALLP together. We made decisions about everything from how to edit and mark up Lowell's letters in XML to the design and function of the site, which will eventually house them. We developed a workflow for the project and wrote a code book documenting our steps. And you'll hear more about that from Caroline, Danielle, and Kiamara. So Lowell's correspondence is massive. It's 53 feet of boxes at Harvard. It's way more than I could do. Probably I'll be working on this for the rest of my life. But for now, I have identified 35 key correspondences, so approximately 1,400 letters related to Lowell's career in poetry for ALLP. In the first phase of the project, and this isn't what I have up on the screen right now, is what these letters look like on Harvard's website. So they've scanned the letters. So this also changed the project when I realized that instead of going to Harvard and scanning everything myself, they've already done the scanning. And their policy is that once stuff is up on their website, it is fair use, open access. Also, Lowell died in 25, so she's out of copyright. In the first phase of the project, we are focusing in particular on letters related to the first decade of the new poetry movement, so 1912 to 1922. And we believe that a digitized, searchable archive of Lowell's letters will be a resource for researchers in early 20th century poetry, periodical studies, book history, rare book and manuscript collecting, women's history, queer studies, Anglo-American adaptations of Asian forms and translations, and Romanticism. And I can talk more about how she gets into those not unexpected fields later if that comes up. Foundational digital projects in my discipline, such as the Modernist Journals Project, allow users to engage with periodicals as early 20th century readers would have encountered them. Lowell's letters, importantly, reveal the labor behind the finished product. In this way, ALLP is a feminist project. Lowell was involved with many overlapping poetic networks. She herself was invested in working collaboratively with other poets. That's the crux of the feud with Pound, who dismissed the Imagist anthologies as a democratic beer garden approach to poetry. The conception of Lowell as a team player really goes against everything we think we know about her. We usually hear about her as an egocentric interloper, a rich woman who bought her way into a movement. We have tried on the team to be similarly collaborative, transparent, and feminist in our approach to this work. In encoding, our priority has been to tag information that can be used to trace the networks Lowell helped build. Alliances, feuds, literary movements, etc. For now, this takes precedence over documenting the materiality of her letters. While Lowell's letters have fewer additions, deletions, and modifications than other collections, because Lowell had secretaries who typed in triplicate. So we don't have to search through diasporic archives to find Lowell's letters that she sent out into the world. At least the first drafts of them are all at Harvard already. Because the work of these letters was done by unnamed secretaries, who we know from at least one tell-all memoir in Lowell's archives, we're not necessarily thrilled to be working for Amy Lowell at all points. She doesn't seem to have been the most thoughtful employer. So we want to honor the work of those unnamed secretaries. So when digitized annotated letters are up on our site eventually, we will link to facsimiles and encourage readers to consider their physical qualities and labor. A digital critical edition of Amy Lowell's letters will contextualize an important moment in literary history and document Lowell's part in it in a way that a print version, which would be organized chronologically, cannot. So there are 3 advantages to a digitized archive of Lowell's correspondence. Digitized correspondence allows us to have aggregated basic letter metadata. So aggregated basic letter metadata, meaning the date, the recipient, the location of the recipient, their gender, etc. We can also have content-specific metadata, topics discussed, personal historical events, people's poems, volumes, periodicals referenced. These will offer Lowell's users of Lowell's letters to search them quickly and effectively. So an advanced search might pull together a series of letters tracing the contours of a story as it develops through Lowell's retelling of it to various correspondence over the years. And an example of that would be the feud with Pound, which happens for, it's a pretty quick dust up. You see that in the letters to Pound, but it ends up informing her letters for years and with at least a dozen interlocutors. That's the most obvious example. And what you see here is a basic spreadsheet that I use when I'm annotating letters to let the encoders know things that they should tag. So if you look at the first one, this is a letter to Harriet Monroe. Just in this one letter, look at all the people she talks about. Look at the subject she talks on, and look at all the magazines that get mentioned just in the course of one letter. A second reason why a digital edition, here's another, we'll talk about this more later. This is our site index, again, showing the way we can aggregate metadata. And then finally, all the metadata that we collect about each correspondent in each letter will be put into the header. So this is the TEI header that goes at the top of every letter. Okay, in the name of going fast. Letter data can eventually be used to create multidimensional visualizations, interactive timelines, pie charts, stacked bar graphs that track Lowell's publications temporally, geospatially, and within social, intellectual, and professional networks. This is an example from the Mina Loy archive by Jesse Jack. It's an interactive story map. It could also look like this. And if you're a modernist, this is a very, very familiar interactive network map from the front cover of Bonnie Kime Scott's book, The Gender of Modernism. We could use visual metadata to create visualizations like this showing interconnectedness. But finally, we can more fully edit and annotate Lowell's massive correspondence as a digital edition. This is both because the digital frees us from the page limitations of a print version. Lowell, I think, is very important, but her erasure from literary history makes it unlikely that she would be a candidate for a multi-volume edition of her letters, as, for example, Robert Frost just got a couple of years ago. But also, a digital edition hypermobilizes the critical apparatus of the footnote, allowing for detailed and interpretive critical markup that can be replicated in letters that share common subjects and events. Okay, right? So I don't have to, at each letter, write the same footnote. You can just hyperlink to it. Okay, so what do we do with this? Next steps. We will aggregate metadata and create visualizations guided by the following questions. How might correspondence metadata support feminist recovery work by demonstrating the centrality of an overlooked figure? How might it also reveal the labor behind the finished product? And I've talked about this throughout the talk. More specifically, how might correspondences from Lowell's archive map the lifespan of little magazines? Her letters show poetry just starting, the little review starting and then closing, and others beginning and busting apart. It's really interesting. How might Lowell's archive trace the mainstreaming of modern poetry in wide circulation magazines such as Saturday Evening Post and The Atlantic? How might it map professional relationships among modern poets? How might it map the life cycle of individual poems as well as individual books of poems, not just Lowell's, but those of the many poets she mentored and advocated for? If you're a fan of Malcolm Cowley, you're going to see her trying very hard to get his career started and lots of bumps along the way before he starts getting attention. Eventually, ALLP will be part of a larger collaborative project called the 20th Century Literary Letters Project. And this is a union catalog like the early modern letters online, MLO union catalog, which is basically a site that is many sites. I'm the project manager for TCLLP. Gabrielle Hinkins at Clemens University is directing it. And what that would do is aggregate metadata from various poets' correspondences so that you could run visualizations and see who's talking about what where, or maybe even animate conversations by linking, well, for example, Lowell's, a letter that Lowell writes to HD and HD's response back. We hope that it will serve, the Lowell's letters will serve as a test case and a starting point for TCLLP and establish an architecture for contributing and using correspondence metadata, documenting workflows and uses of that data as transparently as possible. We are behind in modernist digital humanities, mostly because I believe of, copyright. So whereas the early modernists have been doing this work for a good couple of decades, we're just at the beginning. So Lowell's letters really have an opportunity to set some standards here. Okay, I want to turn the time over now to Caroline, Danielle, and Kiamara. So Caroline, take it away. Do you want me to stop sharing my screen, or do you want to use this?
You can leave it for now. I was thinking I could just kind of like throw out some of the parts of the project that I could speak to, and then see what sticks. Yeah, my name is Caroline McCraw. I am currently a PhD student at UW-Madison in literary studies, and I finished my MA in digital humanities at Loyola, and I was in the practicum class that Missy referenced. So yeah, I was the project manager for kind of that first year during the class and after. And it was very much a point of, you know, first of all, like Missy's like infectious passion for this project. You know, everyone in the class was coming from a different place, but able to find a way to like love Lowell on their own terms and for their own reasons, whether for her translation work, her, you know, identity, all of these different aspects. So we were kind of in a position of conceiving of the project as being a large team, not only the people in the classroom, but as this kind of long span of collaborators that we didn't even know who they would be yet. So kind of laying some of that foundational groundwork, that, you know, really messy digital infrastructure going between Google Drive, GitHub, the Houghton Archive, Dropbox, all of these things, and trying to make some kind of you know, sustainable institutional memory, project memory, that could be easily transferred to folks in the future. So I can speak to kind of creating some of those encoding guidelines, working with people in that practicum class, what it's like to kind of do that kind of project in a classroom setting and then extend it. Yeah, foundational infrastructure, developing workflows. And it was also helpful, I would say, to kind of be conceiving of this project along with Missy as, you know, strategizing funding, because that's kind of, you know, for a grad student, that's really helpful to be like, okay, here's this huge, amazing, ambitious project. How can I do something strategically to kind of ensure its financial sustenance? So yeah, I'll maybe, do we want to all introduce ourselves and then kind of open everything up? All right, Danielle.
Sure. Yeah, hi, I'm Danielle Richards. I'm the current project manager. So I took over after Caroline went to her PhD program. Yeah, and I can mostly talk about what it means to take over as like a second project manager. I had the privilege to work with Caroline over the summer and kind of slowly hand off some of the responsibilities and ask a lot of questions before I had to kind of be responsible for some of the resources. And over the summer, we worked on a really important project, I thought, in making sure that we had a way of tracking the progress of various letters. So just like Caroline had just mentioned, a lot of this project, the thing that feels important right now is being sure that people who come later and do the encoding or even later steps will be able to have the metadata that's necessary, and also just be able to track things and to understand when things were finished in order to give proper attribution and things like that. So we created a giant spreadsheet system to encompass all of the 1,400 letters, where we figured out who was going to, where we were starting with that project because there were so many, and who would be responsible for those first steps. The next thing I worked on was creating Basecamp. We use Basecamp for our kind of as our hub for the transcribers and the encoders. So we keep all of our resources there, our encoding guidelines. There's a really nice ability with Basecamp to be able to search through past conversations. And I came to this project after working on the Lily Elba Digital Archive. And also I'm working on the Dickinson's Birds Listening Project. So using the knowledge that I had from those projects, I knew that we would definitely need some kind of searchability because this project will be kind of a long project, and to be able to look back and search through questions that we've already had or conversations that we've already had would be really important. So yeah, I would love to talk about Basecamp and the uses there. And then the other thing that I'd like to just mention is that as project manager, we very recently created a custom TEI project, and we used Roma Beta for that. So I'd love to talk about that, because that was a brand new experience for me, but it was really helpful in kind of envisioning the whole project and what is important in the project, what we would need to be encoding. So yeah, I'd love to answer questions about any of that stuff, but otherwise I'll turn it over to Kiamara.
Hi, I'm Kiamara Homan, and I'm a PhD candidate at Loyola Chicago. I'm a transcriber and encoder on the project, and when I started working on this project in 2018, it wasn't yet a digital project, so the only digital aspect of my work was that I used optical character recognition, OCR, which really didn't work very well with the files that I downloaded from Hollis, and I found it quicker to retype the shorter files than to clean them up. So when Dr. Bradshaw decided to make this project digital, I was really excited to be involved. Like Danielle, I had some experience with encoding already after working on the Lily Elba Digital Archive with Dr. Pamela Kahi. And I really see digital humanities as an important avenue for future scholarship in the humanities. In addition, Amy Lowell features really prominently in the first chapter of my dissertation. So this project is really personally helpful to me. In fact, I first became aware of the text that later sparked the idea for my dissertation, Lowell's 1921 book, Legends, while transcribing a letter Lowell wrote to Malcolm Cowley in May of 1921. While working on the letters, I've done quite a bit of research on the networks of people, publishers, and books that Lowell refers to, and doing so has really broadened my understanding of the literary landscape at the turn of the 20th century, so I'm happy to speak to that, and just kind of what it looks like to work on a project that is kind of parallel to my own research. I've also really appreciated the careful planning that's gone into this project. So Dr. Bradshaw and the team really thought about what information should be encoded, and the guidelines that Caroline wrote up for the project are very clear. So it was easy for me to step back into the project and begin the work of encoding the letters. I also really appreciate all of the ways in which we're in communication with each other on the project. Melissa, could you go to the next slide for me? I don't think I have control of it right now. Thank you. So the possible additions section of the site index includes a space for notes and questions, but as has already, and that's right here, as has already been mentioned, we also use Basecamp to discuss questions. I found both particularly helpful through the process because in my experience, as most of you probably know, working on digital projects, the further you get into them, the more they tend to balloon, and you might be going in and out of working on the project depending on how far along it is. So it's really important to have a clear and easily accessible location in which these practical and technical discussions about the project are stored. I'll stop there, but I'm happy to answer any questions about the process of transcribing and encoding, the ways in which this project have played into my own research, using the Hollis archives, and the ways in which I've seen this project transform since I began in the summer of 2018.
Thanks so much, you guys. That was great. And you all touched on a lot of the questions I myself have in my notes here. But we have two questions from the audience, so let me go ahead and give you those first. Okay, so I have the first question. How did you choose the keywords for subjects in the metadata?
That came, I would say, I can start with that, but Caroline, I think this would be good for you to jump in on. Well, I think that it came out of our conversations in that first practicum, and it came from a lot of writing on the whiteboard. I think there was an assignment one week where I had each of them take, they got to pick a corpus of letters and spend some time with it and come back and talk about themes, names that occurred.
Yeah, and I would say that's kind of where the like editorial process comes in. So both kind of building on Missy's, long standing scholarship, and then just kind of picking up on, because we can never be totally exhaustive, especially in the beginning, but because it is digital, it can always be layered back onto. So I think those were just kind of the priorities that seem to resonate with everyone in those keywords.
I will say also, we started with a sample letter set of just 10 letters, and this is something the class called me on. These were letters that I had imagined when I was going to make this a codex. I picked the most salacious letters, like where Lowell was the angriest or the most vituperative, where she like calls William Carlos Williams pathetic. And or where it talks about poor Harriet Monroe is losing all her hair. And I just thought these letters were so awesome. And obviously everybody would love them. And the graduate student said, so we had those 10 letters that we were working on, and we pulled keywords out of that. But the graduate student said, you need to maybe chill out a little bit on Lowell's nastiness, because for whatever reason in your career, this seems helpful for you. And it has been. Lowell has been she's been a privilege and a joy and a big albatross. And I really have resisted doing the letters because I didn't want her to define my whole career, but they're so good. But the students really challenged me to be a little more positive about what Lowell had to offer to poetry and not think of this as just gossip, which, I don't know, those of you who have worked on something a long time, maybe that's just something that happens, but they really pushed me to be more positive about what she had to offer.
I love that. I love that the way you are during this presentation and in the project itself, sort of emphasizing the collaborative aspect of you with the graduate students you're working with. And that's obviously those of us who are involved in other projects are like so happy to hear, because that's not, sometimes it doesn't happen that way, right? So the next question is, can you just briefly explain what TEI is?
Absolutely. I will turn that over to somebody else, but it's the Textual Encoding Initiative. And I can talk about it, but I know that the graduate students can talk to it much better.
And Danielle, you were typing, so we can tag team. Go for it.
It's something that, I was only introduced to in, I think, 2017 when we started on the Lily Elba Digital Archives. So I'm relatively new to it as well, but yeah, it's a style of encoding that the options given to you are things that are very helpful for a lot of projects in the humanities. So tagging people and places and ideas and organizations, dates and various things that will help use, like the text will then become something that you can pull from and like aggregate, kind of like we were talking with the metadata. So there is a standard, there's a standard kind of way that you do TEI in order to help it be kind of readable across various platforms.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good question. Thank you for asking us about encoding, because I think I, for one, am used to talking to, people who are already immersed in it. But kind of like big picture, like what happens when you take a physical text and put it in a digital form. Okay, you can have a scan of the facsimile, but you can't really do anything. You can't search those words. Then you could just have a transcription, so you can just search the content. But with encoding, you're able to convert all of that text into data that can then be sorted and transformed, visualized. So even if someone doesn't say someone's name explicitly and uses a pronoun, you can still tag that pronoun as that individual and still find every point that they're referenced, and then kind of be able to create this larger scale assessment. And the TEI is a standardized form. It's the Textual Encoding Initiative. So that means that if we are encoding with TEI standards, then tools that are made to be compatible with TEI can use the data that we're creating. So it is kind of this, thinking forward, trying to create text that is material that other people can use. So we're both creating a product and a tool at the same time.
It's supposed to guarantee the longevity you know, like the world could end, but if these things are encoded in TEI, somebody could come along in 5,000 years and still read Amy Lowell's letters.
And I just wanted to mention some of the things that you can capture, like you can get people and place names, you can capture, well, you can obviously capture the material qualities of the letter, like paragraph or page breaks, but you can also make some stylistic changes to the piece as well and capture things like additions and deletions to the letter or other text you're working with. So it's really a very flexible tool, and Danielle just mentioned the customization that she did, but that really allows you to manipulate the schema so that you can decide what data exactly you'd like to capture in your project.
I don't have access to type anything, but the address is tei-c.org. And according to Laura Mandel, who's really important in digital humanities, it's non-negotiable. Like, this is what humanities digital projects should be using to encode information.
Missy, you don't have access to the chat down at the bottom.
I can see the chat, but I can't type in it.
Oh, all right. Well, here, I will type it in here and we'll throw it out to the audience. Can you give me that website again?
tei-c.org.
There you go. Great, thanks. Okay. How many students are doing MA or PhD thesis projects directly tied to the archive on a theoretical level of editing and coding issues, or directly using the archive as it gets built for their research on that author as one of their sources?
Well, in the name of positive spin, we're going to be brief on this. None. I mean, Kiamara is using it a little bit. I'm in a liminal role at Loyola University, so I am a senior lecturer. I have associate graduate faculty status, which means I can sit on dissertations but I can't direct them. So I'm limited in what I can do, and I'm just always hoping that I can find students who are willing to come in and work on this. I don't know, Kiki, if you wanted to.
Yeah, I'm using, as I said, I'm definitely using the letters as part of the research that I'm doing in my dissertation. And the letter that Lowell wrote to Malcolm Calley, where she mentions legends, really did kind of spur my interest in how American poets are using Chinese mythology to explore social issues in the US. So in that sense, I would say that as I'm reading through the letters, I'm looking for her kind of discussion of those issues, but I'm not talking about it. I'm not talking about the digital aspects of the project.
But it's going to be going on the rest of my life, so somebody could at some point.
That's what I was going to say. Once your site is live, right, and available to the general public, I'm sure people will be using it more or using it. So this is Professor Karen Leak is in the audience. Hello, yes. Karen. And she wanted to tell you, Melissa, that she was at the Newberry a few weeks ago and came across some hilarious letters from Lowell to Eunice. I don't know how to say this. Tietjens, 1919.
Yes.
She's making excuses for not including Tietjens' new book in the list of best new books.
Yeah, I'm so glad that Karen wrote that. Tietjens, and you can think of the name as Tight Jeans. That's how they talk about her at the Newberry, where her stuff is archived. She was the second assistant editor at Poetry Magazine after Alice Corbin Henderson had to move to New Mexico because of tuberculosis. Eunice Tietjens stepped up, and yes, I love those letters, and I know those letters. One thing that I love so much about this project is I've been in Lowell's world for 20 years, and there are people like Eunice Tietjens and Grace Hazard Conkling, who taught at Smith College and taught the first modern poetry classes in a college setting, and Jean Starr Untermeyer, Louis Untermeyer's wife. These are people who I know, like they're my friends because Lowell talked to them so much. And I feel like this project has the ability to naturalize some of those names that have been so totally erased. I joke with the librarians or the manuscript curators at the Newberry that I've taught the Newberry Library undergraduate seminar twice now. And I've got some great UIC students in it this semester, in fact. And they all think Eunice Tegens is like, they don't know that she's not in the canon. And I think that Lowell's letters are such a great way to just, you obliterate the canon by making it not relevant, right? Like, here's what the literature world that she engaged in looked like, and here are the people that mattered to her, right? So it becomes conversation specific, not anthology specific. So yeah, thanks, Karen.
Okay, this next question is for Danielle and Caroline. Did you receive any training in project management prior to taking on the role? If not, what have you found useful in picking up those skills, and how do they align with your scholarly work and development?
Caroline, if you want to start.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I have any formal training in the digital humanities MA program at Loyola. It's very like project oriented. So I got a lot of just kind of like exposure to many different projects and kind of, you know, working on tiny little aspects of them. And then with Kiki and Danielle working on the Lily Elba Digital Archive was kind of the big one that we were all kind of involved with for a long time. And for full, you know, labor and academia transparency, I think I got the most project management training running a summer camp at the Old Town School of Folk Music. I think that's where I learned how to make a spreadsheet, how to use Trello, how to delegate, how to, you know, mark tasks, and yeah.
Yeah, I also didn't have any formal training in how to project manage, but, you know, I worked on the Lily Elba Digital Archive for almost 3 years before starting in on this project. And our project manager for that, Emily Datsku, was, I was in constant communication with her, with Lily Elba, and we did a presentation together at Reed College, I think in 2019, on digital projects in the humanities, and specifically teaching that with getting undergrads to help. So yeah, I think that seeing her run that really helped. And then also kind of understanding the ways that that project differed from this one. It became pretty clear what was necessary and what kind of differences, you know, we needed to account for. So yeah, I think it's been really helpful. I think the second part of that question, my scholarly work and development, this has just become something, DH and digital projects in general, it's really become something that I've been passionate about. I didn't expect that when I started in a few years ago. I was really kind of just trying to, you know, try something new. And the Lily Elba project was, you know, a modernist project, a queer theory project. There was so much, so many exciting things about that project. So I started in with that, and I've really grown to love DH. So I feel like it's kind of changed some of my scholarly interests in that way. But yeah, it's been something that I think a lot of us have fallen into, as opposed to, you know, kind of being trained to take on these roles. I think we kind of are getting trained as we do it. So
yeah, and excuse me, to address the second half of the question, I think that, I mean, my work is primarily concerned with digital textuality, so that, you know, ties in pretty closely to what Danielle's talking about. But I think that the kind of, I think it's really important, especially for digital projects, for the process to be also a product at the same time, especially for students. And so in teaching, and, you know, to be able, even after a semester, to give students, whether undergrad or graduate, just like something tangible and like proof of the work of what they can do, I think is completely invaluable. And I think that that ties into project management, because you have to be able to kind of see those chunks rather than like, oh, we all work really hard under the radar for 5 years and then this thing pops up. I think there's ways to do it where that whole 5 years is kind of meaningful to everyone involved in real time.
Great. Thank you. Okay, next up. What is your cadence for planning project workflow? Is this still primarily a graduate class? And if so, do you plan on a semester by semester basis? And how big is your project team? That's like 3 questions, right? So, okay, first,
Right.
what is your cadence for planning project workflow? Yeah.
Well, the you know, the saying in digital humanities, you do the work when you get the money, right? You can't do much if you don't have funding. So I just got an NEH Mellon Foundation Fellowship for Digital Production, which is going to give me a year's research leave. And again, because I'm an NTT, I'm not
Working
eligible.
fine.
Pardon? Oh, because I'm an NTT, I'm not eligible for a research leave through my university. So the NEH fellowship is going to give me a year. And in that year, I'm going to try to catch up. So what happens is we started talking about ALLP, and the students just ran with it and helped organize it. We've got all of our infrastructure set up. We have people transcribing letters. We have people encoding letters, but I need time to annotate them, because ultimately I'm the one who knows about who she's talking to, what she's saying. And I also, as an editor, claim a narrative voice, because editing is interpretation, right? So I'm going to spend the next year, I have an ambitious plan to annotate 800 letters, specifically related to 1912 to 1922. So that's what's up next. As far as what the workflow is and what will happen with graduate students doing the work semester by semester, that really depends on graduate student interest, because I don't have a class. I don't have a specific class to teach. Now, when I come back from my leave, maybe Liz Hopwood would have me teach that graduate practicum again, in which case we would get a new group of graduate students working on it. I really rely at this point on the goodwill of the graduate students who are working on it to, I mean, goodwill, but also they have a personal investment in establishing themselves as DH scholars, and this is a project that they can work on and cut their teeth on. So right now my project team is about 5 of us, would you say? Maybe 4 or 5. The Center for Digital Textual Studies and Digital Humanities gave me a graduate student, or they did not give me a graduate student. They let a graduate student work on the project. Prakriti Maniar has worked on it the last 2 semesters. And I have an undergraduate, Orion Elrod, who got a provost fellowship to work on the project. And he has really gotten invested in Lowell's communications with the big publishers, with Ferris Greenslet at Houghton Mifflin and Edward C. Marsh at Macmillan. And he's really interested in looking at Lowell operating as a business manager with those big presses, and the way he sees her mentoring people in those communications with the big presses. So I think at this point, I really have to let students work on the parts that are exciting to them, to the collections of letters that speak to their interests and their work. I'm always on the job market, and this is a portable project. So ultimately, my hope is that I will be in a tenured position where I have regular access to research leave and regular access to research assistance. So.
Great, thank you, Misty. Okay, so other than Basecamp, have you found any other tools of project management helpful, i.e. project dashboards? And then I have a related question right after this that you could probably fold in, which is, can you explain how Basecamp is different from Slack?
I can talk about that a little bit. Yeah, so Basecamp is our main kind of hub, I like to call it. I have not used Slack for any kind of DH project. I use it for a movie group that I'm in. So I'm much more familiar with it with a kind of a casual usage. But yeah, let's see, I guess Melissa's got it up here. So the base
So
camp,
this is Basecamp.
yeah, and if you'd click on that, you can just kind of see the basic layout here. So we don't even use all of the categories, you know, scheduling and automatic check-ins. I don't feel if we had people who were, you know, needing to get certain deadlines done, I could use that. But right now, what we really use is the message board and the docs and files categories. It also just has a nice way of using notifications. So you don't get notifications constantly. You can kind of monitor them yourself. So you might get a roundup every morning, or also on that main homepage, if you scroll down, it shows you all the new stuff that's occurred in the last day or so. So it's a nice way of kind of tracking the chronology of things. But the most valuable feature, I think, is that it's searchable. So because we've talked about the cadence of the progress and the workflow, we don't know how long in the future, how, you know, it could be several years until someone has a certain question that we've already kind of discussed. I might not be the project manager anymore, or, you know, there could be a lot of new encoders or things like that. So in the message board, you can kind of search things, and I'm pretty careful to document as much as I can. If any important emails happen off of Basecamp, we can kind of add some discussion there so that we can make sure that stuff is all documented. So that's really helpful, I think, and being able to like tag people and ask particular questions in their right categories. The other category there, Missy, if you'd go to the docs and files section, we use a lot of different platforms for holding our materials. So we have GitHub, we have Dropbox, we use Google Sheets. And those are the main kind of storage facilities. But if you look at the other folders for encoders or encoders or transcribers, they really don't need to see everything, or at least, you know, it's helpful if they're familiar with things, but I wanted to have a place where only the things relevant for encoders would be just right there. Not that they can't access the other stuff, but in order to try to make it as streamlined as possible, these will all link out to the various places they need to go. So in the, you know, in describing what their process might look like, there's just a few places they can look instead of having to have a lot of different logins and search through old emails or things like that. So yeah, that's one of the reasons we chose Basecamp. I'm sure Slack could also be useful in this way. If Caroline, do you want to talk about Slack? I think have you used Slack, or are you more familiar with DH?
I would almost describe Basecamp as like a mashup of Google Drive and Slack. So it has kind of like the conversational tagging, you know, kind of self-referencing archive of Slack, but it's a little more stable. So I know Slack, you know, if you have the free version, it erases all of your messages after 3 months. So Basecamp is kind of a place where you can organize things a little differently, a little more familiar. And I think that one of the great things about Basecamp is that it is a very accessible space. Like, I think the learning curve, even for people who are just doing the transcriptions, who are like, I am not in the code, I don't need to know about the code, they can still be using Basecamp. We did start with GitHub. Actually, Missy, I can share my screen. I have them both pulled up so we can kind of compare. So we do have a GitHub, which, especially in the beginning when we were it was a smaller team and it was only a few of us kind of concentrated on thinking through these things. And we used the projects, which is now empty because we have finished it, but here's one from another thing that I have. So you can just kind of see just a very simple like Kanban, like moving things around, tagging, marking, which is really served our purpose. But I think GitHub can also be a very intimidating space, especially if you aren't familiar. Its biggest benefit for those who do code is that it has version control. So you can both see any changes made to anything on your GitHub, and you can also collaborate on code documents at the same time. So there aren't like multiple versions floating around of one document that has certain changes. So then compared to the Basecamp, where we can even link, like basically anything can be added to Basecamp. So I could put links to GitHub files, I could put links to Google Drive files, and yeah.
And GitHub is public facing, and that's important. We really do want there to be total transparency about what we're doing up to a point. We really appreciate Basecamp letting us ask kind of dumb questions sometimes, or questions that people might feel shy about asking, especially as people transition into the project who don't have a background in modern poetry. So we're kind of trying to have the best of both worlds, a private workspace, but also a public facing workspace.
Yeah, I've seen Basecamp before, but I've never seen it used. I don't think I've seen all of its functions sort of utilized the way you guys have utilized them. So that was really impressive to see. I aspire to get our Basecamp up and running and looking like y'all's. Okay,
That's so, Caroline brought us that.
Yeah, great. Yeah, that's really well done. So I have a question here from Mark Canuel, who Melissa says to tell you hello. He asks if you have thoughts about ways in which you or others have gotten grad students interested in digital projects, teaching, advertising, workshops. Do the students you work with already have training, or do they get the training in the process of working on the project? I think we sort of answered that second half of that question. But the first half, how can you get graduate students interested in digital projects?
Graduate students are interested in digital projects. The push is to get faculty and administrators to allow students to participate in the digital projects, and we have found pushback from faculty who think that this might be a distraction from literary studies. And my feeling about digital humanities is it's where theory was in the 90s, where we thought that theory was going to be something you could specialize in. And pretty quickly, within a decade, job candidates were expected to have fluency in literary theory. And I think the same thing is going to be true of digital methodologies. I think students are going to need to have at least a little bit of fluency and experience. So if you give them the opportunities, the students will come, is my feeling. And even if they don't think they care about the project, they are remarkably good at, they're good. First of all, trust the students and their intelligence and their self-determination and their motivation and drive. They will find parts of the digital project that speak to their research interests and that help them plan a future for themselves that may or may not involve your projects. You also have to be willing to let them cycle in and out of the project. And you have to be willing to listen to them and let them help you shape the project, I think. But I would love to have the graduate students speak to this.
Yeah, I think that Danielle and I maybe heard about the digital aspect of this project when Melissa gave a talk at the CTSDH, and I think we both approached her saying, I want to work on this project. So yeah, as she said there, we have a lot of interest in working on these types of projects. I really see this as a way to distinguish myself on the job market, but also I think that creating these digital archives is so important in making materials accessible, in kind of allowing for new types of connections to be made between different materials, between different authors, between different scholars. And so I think that this project and projects like it really open up a lot of different avenues that are not possible in traditional textual-based scholarship, or print-based scholarship, sorry. As far as training in coding and things like that, Danielle and I both started working on the Lily Elba project with basically no knowledge of how to encode, and we learned on the job. So we were given some instruction right at the beginning from Dr. Hopwood, and she kind of taught us the basics of TEI and using XML to encode versions of the Lily Elba narrative to create that archive. But it's something that we've kind of developed over the past 4 or 5 years. So.
Yeah, and the CTSDH at Loyola has been just wonderful about really listening to what questions we had and what we wanted to learn. We recently had a workshop on TEI customization, which again is just kind of a way of using the code to shape your project, and then also using the project to shape the code. So there's kind of like they kind of need to grow together. So we were really, unsure of how to move on to that next step, and the CTSDH just hosted a workshop with that. So yeah, it's been really great to have that kind of. They've just been really listening to us, I think, especially as English scholars who maybe don't have the opportunity in their own department to have these kind of workshops, but to be able to have that crossover and that interdisciplinary sense has just been really, really awesome.
Yeah, and sorry, Carolyn, I just wanted to add along those lines that working with the graduate students in DH has been really helpful too. So Rebecca Parker was the editor on the Lily Elba project, and she taught Danielle and I so much about what we could do with TEI. So just learning, kind of gaining from the expertise of the other students in the DH graduate program.
Yeah, I feel like there's like opportunities for collaboration. So it's not just this like, oh, we're over here, you're over there, and you have to be really brave to go to the other side. But I think there is so much collaborative potential. And I think this question also really speaks to the question of digital labor. And that, DH projects, like there is so much work, there's so much different kinds of work that can be paid, and grad students want to get paid. So not to totally reduce that question to just pay them and then they'll be interested. But I think, graduate student precarity is so real, and that can be, really dissuade people from trying something new if they don't, if it's going to be a lot of work and a long time before they see that payoff immediately in their own research. So I think that that's a really easy way to start. And then that can also be, and I will say, I think Missy's been so great in advocating for all of us getting compensated, which is not usually the case. And that paired with, I think, the practicum, where it was, every individual was really able to identify what skills they wanted to work on, kind of what they wanted to take away from it. And that became the project.
I've been really lucky to have 2 summers where the Office of Research Services at Loyola gave me seed money that I turned over completely to the graduate students, and I was able to bring people in to work during the summers. And that's where a lot of this work has gotten done. So I would say if you are thinking about a DH project, you're always going to feel like it's not far enough along to ask for funding, but it's always, I heard a long time ago, and this sticks with me so much, it's always somebody's first day of DH. Like, let today be your first day, map it out. At Loyola, we had a grants workshop where I got to talk to other faculty members about the kind of grants they were writing. And that's where I learned about these seed money projects, which the whole point, or the whole point of these seed money grants is to help you make a persuasive case for a bigger grant. So I was able to get this twice. I was able to get these graduate students to work with. That led to Liz having me teach the practicum. That led to me having another whole summer where we really built the infrastructure. And that was part of my narrative for the NEH Mellon. I would not have gotten the NEH Mellon if I hadn't had all these wonderful graduate students helping me design and just really backload the infrastructure for this project. So don't be, just my advice is go for it. The worst that can happen is that your grant will be rejected, but grants usually get rejected with an explanation for why, and that's just going to help you revise it and rethink it. $5,000 over the course of a summer can get you some graduate students. So.
And I would add that is very Amy Lowell. Her letters are all about pay this person, get this person published and pay them. So a community of advocacy.
That's great. I have a question for Kiamara, Danielle, and Caroline. Did any of you, so I know some of you worked on the Lily Elba project prior to this. I'm wondering, have you done any DH projects on your own, collaboratively with just other graduate students, or just on your own, or just with faculty?
I have not done any projects on my own. I would love to someday, but the dissertation is definitely at the forefront of my, that's what I'm spending my time on right now. But I feel like after the projects that I've done, it's definitely an option for the future. And I would love to do a project with other grad students, but I haven't done anything yet.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same position as Danielle. So I've worked exclusively with faculty so far, and I'm working on my dissertation right now, trying to get that out. But I do see there are some projects that I'd like to pursue after I finish my dissertation in DH. So I would like to transform some of the material that I've kind of gathered for my dissertation into digital forms in the future.
Yeah, and I think, you know, coming from a DHMA, there was a lot of, you know, collaboration. You know, there were various, you know, like apps that were dreamt up that we then decided not to pursue. But right now, my kind of longest standing individual research is about a book at the Newberry of 18th, 19th century trade cards, still very much in draft form. And there's the website. So that has been a really exciting way for me to kind of just like poke around and like low stakes. I'm not messing up anyone else's workflow if I totally, you know, mess up the geolocation plugin or something. But that's kind of where my research is continuing, although it's on a bit of a hiatus as I am slammed with coursework in my first year. So.
Caroline, I think I've heard of your project actually.
Really?
Yeah, I'm definitely definitely that sounds familiar. I'll have to think back of where I heard it, but
well,
I'm at the Newberry a fair amount, so maybe that's where.
I think a couple of weeks ago, I believe the Newberry had a big trade card. You know, they send out their weekly blasts, and I think that they had a trade card thing. And I was wondering if that was incorporating your.
It wasn't. I've been in touch with a handful of the Newberry folks, but also trade cards have been getting like a weird amount of popularity recently. I've just seen them popping up all over Twitter, all over emails. I'm like, what?
Yeah, that might have been where. So the reason I was asking was because I'm just sort of wondering if graduate students are generating ideas for digital projects on their own while they're still, you know, in their program, if that's something that's happening, or if it's more, you know, the faculty are coming up with projects and the graduate students, and that's how graduate students are getting interested in digital humanities. Chicken or egg? I have a question from Professor Rachel Haverlock, who is part of Freshwater Lab, who will be presenting. Her team will be presenting next. Thanks for being here, Rachel. She asked, to what degree does the medium of your work correspond with or amplify the literary content of your research?
And is that for me or for the
Melissa? Yeah. No, I think probably for you, Melissa. Yeah.
So could you repeat the question?
Yeah. To what degree does the medium of your work correspond with or amplify the literary content of your research?
That is an interesting and a difficult question. So I've written a book on Lowell. I've done 2 collections of Lowell, an edition of articles and a book of poetry. But I had really set my Lowell work aside, and I'm working on a book on poetic ephemera and the way that things like postage stamps and shot glasses really circulate iconic images of women poets. So that's the book I want to write. That's my monograph. The letters, I, I really came back to them because they have legs, because they are an opportunity for me to, days I was desperate for. This was driven by a need for a research leave. I'm going to have the first research leave of my career because of the NEH Mellon. Thank you. And it was really about being entrepreneurial and being mercenary. And the letters seemed like a place where I could both have an intellectual project that was engaging, and it is. I love this work so much, and I am so excited to get to dive into 1,400 letters and shape a narrative or offer an interpretation, right? But I really was pulled, what made it urgent and immediate was needing to find a project that would give me some kind of purchase on intellectual authority. And I don't think that's necessary. I don't think that's the best way to do it, but that's the best way. That's what worked for me. And then to find out, to be me sitting there thinking like, how can I get a leave? How can I get something that the NEH will fund? And then having graduate students say, oh my God, this is really great. And then kind of feeding off of their energy made the project an intellectual place that I'm very happy to live for the next decade or two. I don't know if that answers the question. And maybe the poetic ephemera book will get written at the margins, but this work feels urgent and completely fulfilling. So.
And I think also, just to throw in to articulate something that I think has been mentioned, I think first of all, like that letters lend themselves so much to the digital because they are more than just the text. They are contingent on time and place and motion. And those are things that the digital can map and track. And then also, I think that, we've mentioned that the content of the letters is extremely collaborative. It's all about this like massive network, kind of, debunking this, genius myth of, these male poets just coming up with poetry and succeeding all on their own. Whereas it was a huge collaborative effort and network that Lowell played a very big part in. And so that's kind of what our process is as well. So not only working with Lowell, but then also eventually expanding up to other modernist letters and just being able to see these very beginning stages of what the poetry industry and community was like.
Great, thank you. Okay, Melissa, you mentioned at the start the prioritizing of neglected or minor authors in DH work, but that can also make it hard to secure funding. Amy Lowell is a well-known poet with connections to many other modernists. Lily Elba is less known and not a priority for US funding institutions, we've found. So while funding students is a priority, and I too have used funds I've secured to pay students over the summer and have helped undergrads to secure paid fellowships, but let's not underestimate the value of volunteers. Students like Orion Elrod, who was both a paid and a volunteer member of our project team for Lily Elba, continued unpaid because of his excitement about and commitment to the project. This is Pamela Coffey. So I'm assuming you guys all know her. How do we build and sustain such projects if we are not able to pay for student labor? Are we taking advantage of them, or are we training them in skills that may assist them in the future, just as Danielle and Kiki have been able to contribute to other projects because of being trained through the Lily Elba project?
Right. And I think, well, I know Pamela, one of my closest friends, and I don't believe she expects me to have an answer for that. That's more a question to turn out to all of you. Like, what is, how can we both get more, knowing how valuable this work is and the immediate transferability of the skills that the students gain from working on these kinds of projects, technical skills, but also the intellectual skills that they gain from these projects. How can we advocate more fiercely for for more funding, right? How can we get more course crossover so that students who want to work on these projects can do it as part of coursework? how can we get more research assistantships tied to this kind of work? I mean, I believe I think that's the spirit of Pamela's comment, is turning this out to all of us. We know this work is important, so what are we going to do about it, right? And how do we make sure that when students, I mean, she's right, we do have students who want to volunteer. I'm always so moved by the unpaid labor that students put into this without me even asking. How do we treat them right? How do we make sure that this experience is a positive one for them? I don't know if any of you want to jump in on that or.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I volunteered on the Lily Elba project, and I also received payment for some of the work that I did on that as well. So I do want to say that, but I think part of it for me has been the development of skills has been really important. This is something that I think, as I said, will kind of distinguish me on the job market, I'm hoping. So, so that's really important to me. I'd like to be able to do digital projects in the future, and I wouldn't have been able to do that without this foundation. But the other thing that's been really helpful is being invited to present at conferences with faculty members. And you know, I mean, that's really being able to build my CV in that way and have that kind of tangible evidence of my involvement in DH projects, particularly because there's not a certificate program at Loyola. So I can't say, oh, I've taken this coursework. So being able to have CV lines at conferences, but also being credited on the Lily Elba website and has been really great, just having that, you know, I can point to, here's this website and you can see my name as an encoder and kind of see the work that I've done. So that's been really great for me as well.
There's a great article, I can't remember who wrote it, but it's in the journal Feminist Modernist Studies, and there was a digital edition. And it talks about the ethics of feminist DH, and it talks about issues like this. How do you incorporate students? And I think that if anybody's looking for a model of working ethically with students, Pamela Kahi's work on Lily Elba has really been exemplary. She goes out of her way to, you know, when she gets paid for a project, she puts it back out to the students first. She looks for ways for them to be compensated, but she also makes sure that they get bylines. You know, she publishes with her students, and she tries always, she's asking herself the question, how do I make this work for the students? So I just think faculty need to step back, or not step back, but really be willing to work with students. And to share not only the labor, but to share the credit. So we have a great model at Loyola.
Yeah, thanks for that. That was great. I just want to add that I think it's important that when grad students are working with faculty, that they're not relegated to a position that feels like something like an assistant, right? Yeah, that doesn't, especially if it's unpaid labor, right? You need to gain those skills. Well, we are almost out of time. We have 2 more minutes before we take a 10-minute break. Is there anything, Melissa, Yamara, Danielle, Caroline, that you'd want to share with us? Any last tidbits of practical, pragmatic advice before we go on break? We covered a lot of ground. Yeah.
I feel like we did. Thank you for the questions. These were really, really good questions and probing questions. I appreciate them.
Yeah, I agree. This has been great. Well, thank you. Thank you all so much again for being with us today.
Follow us on Twitter. Join our GitHub site. Reach out if you have any questions, or if you want to participate. There's always room for people on the Amy Lowell Letters Project.
Oh, that's wonderful. All right, great. All right, well, we are going to take a 10-minute break, and when we get back, Janet is going to lead our second session with the Freshwater Labs project, the Backward River. So we'll see everyone at 10:35. Thanks again.
Okay. So welcome back. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that we're recording and to please type in any of your questions in the Q&A and not the chat. So for our second session, it's my pleasure to introduce members of the Freshwater Lab, the creators of the Backward River Project. The Backward River in question is the Chicago, reversed at the dawn of the 20th century to serve industrial capitalism in a rising metropolis. And the Backward River team are members of the UIC Freshwater Lab, an interdisciplinary consortium led by founder and director Rachel Haverlock. The project members who have joined us today are Rachel Haverlock, the project director and associate professor in the Department of English here at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Justin Radin, a research associate PhD student at in the Department of English. Anish Taylor, a research associate and a master's student in the Department of Urban Planning and Policy at UIC. Erica Chavez, a research associate and director of marketing and communications in the College of Applied Health Sciences. And Becky Lyons, a research associate and master's in urban planning. So welcome.
Thank you, Janet, and thank you, Janet and Carla, the Digital Humanities Initiative, and our wonderful UIC Humanities Institute. I'm so glad that the spirit, of course, is manifest all year on Zoom, and I can't wait to get back in that building and linger at academic talks and events and to be with you all there. So I'm really excited that to have been asked. And I will share my screen and talk a little bit about the Freshwater Lab and its relationship to digital storytelling. And then we will start to unfold our ongoing projects called the Backward River. So I'm going to do a quick share screen. And I don't have a formal slide deck. I want to show the websites themselves, so I might have to do some clicking on and off to navigate through them. So the first thing that I want to share with everyone, the Freshwater Lab, as Janet announced, it's an initiative that considers shared water, water bodies and water through pipes from a humanistic perspective. So we do have some scientists in our ranks, but the idea is to really think about the different kinds of relationships that humans and communities have with water, how infrastructure mediates those relationships, and as well to really emphasize the differential experiences that people have of the same bodies of water based on economic class, gender, and most importantly, as our research has found, based on race. So at the same time, the digital format is very important to me personally for the following reasons. When we think about things like relationships with water and the mediation through infrastructure, this is necessarily a multivocal, multi-perspective overview. And also, hang on, sorry, I got some background noise, everyone. I think I need to, excuse me, let me just mute myself for 1 second. Okay, so there we go. I'm talking about like multivocal, but I can't take more than one source of sound, so take that where you will. But in other words, the digital format is very important for me for kind of this layered, simultaneous, contradictory view that we can get of different community and individual relationships with water. Also, of course, the changeability of things like the course of water, people's experience of water, the quality itself. So the kind of changeability and the way in which a digital space can morph and be updated and be added to is also, from a formal perspective, really important to me. One more kind of approach that I'd like to bring to the table is that we have connections, often invisible and very hard for us to chart, but we have interconnections. As much as our experience of water can be different, we have shared interests with every other person and every other species that is dependent upon the same source of water. And so that idea of trying to realize, visualize, represent, critique those bonds that are formed by sharing a source of water. And for me, that this kind of bioregional sense of place and community is something that is, non-national, post-national, and potentially a very important mode of thinking about solidarity as climate change exacerbates and we get deeper and more stuck in this era of the Anthropocene. Okay, so to the specifics. The Freshwater Lab's very first digital storytelling project is this, what I'm showing to you right now on the screen, and people are welcome to follow along. This is freshwaterstories.com. And the premise behind Freshwater Stories was that in the summer of 2017, team members and I went around Lake Michigan and conducted community-based workshops. Indigenous communities, urban communities, rural communities. We sort of went around and met our authors, did folklore research, and gathered up freshwater stories that are also a guide to understanding Lake Michigan. I'm just going to show you the home page here because what we tried to do with Freshwater Stories was also to visualize two premises that are central in environmental humanities. The first being ideas of the public trust, this legal notion in the United States that surface waters belong to everyone living in a water basin and are managed by elected officials operating in that public trust. So from a legal premise, we can talk about public trust after, but we tried on the homepage of Freshwater Stories to just express that in 2 sentences, that this is your lake, your water, your future, and it needs you. And then we tried to take this overarching premise of the public trust and bring it down to our site of focus on Freshwater Stories, Lake Michigan. And we introduce Lake Michigan, have some interactive polls on the website. And then here in this graph, hopefully you can see it all at once with the drop of water at the top. This graph here, which is also our attempt for a non-linear look at all the different issues, approaches, and experiences of Lake Michigan that occur at once. And so this graph from our view was intended to represent another premise, which is very important to the Freshwater Lab's work, which is the idea of the hydrosocial cycle. And anyone who's been in my class sort of knows these first few weeks when we grasp the hydrosocial cycle. But a way of saying it briefly while showing this graph is that many elementary school students are given confidence in something called the water cycle or the hydraulic cycle, in which you see evaporation, condensation, precipitation. And it's this representation of a kind of a wholeness and certainty about water, as if that cycle is unchanged and ceaseless, no matter what human activities intervene. And so, of course, we look a bit into the history of that. Of course, the notion of the hydraulic cycle came into being with sort of the first big era of American national water management. So in other words, right when the Army Corps was irrevocably changing the cycle of water, this notion of a transcendent, eternal, natural cycle was presented. So the hydrosocial cycle expands upon that and thinks of all the different ways that human actions determine whether a single drop of water will be returned to the system, will be lost forever, will be polluted, and what different communities that drop might encounter. So let me see now if my screen share will let me move to a different website. Okay, Carla is nodding. Okay, so let me bring you now to the Freshwater Lab's current project, the Backward River, which is concerned with another body of water integrally connected to Lake Michigan, the Chicago River, that is at once the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. So again, we can see how the digital space is extremely important because this body of water is many things at once. It is a sanitary and ship canal. It is a river with many branches. It is an industrial dumping ground. It is an urban playground. It is an amenity. It is a nuisance, right? It's many things at once. And so we were lucky enough, I'll go to my gratitude page here for a moment. Carla, can you see this as well? So in this project, which I see as the next chapter following Freshwater Stories, and we are in the process of applying for grants to keep this going. The direction in which hopefully it will keep going is geographic, because this Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, or even here's one more label to layer on top of our discussion, Chicago Area Waterway System, connects North America's mighty watersheds, the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. And importantly, the Chicago Area Waterway System brings the waste of our own metropolis and carries it all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, where the dead zone has now reached the size of the state of New Jersey. So we started at Lake Michigan. We are all wrapped up in the Chicago Area Waterway System, and hopefully the grant funding will arrive so that we can continue and do this work along the Calumet, the Illinois, and the Mississippi rivers. So just in gratitude, the funding for this project came from a group called Freshwater Future. Really importantly, the Humanities Without Walls program based at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and run by Professor Antoinette Burton. That is the initiative that just brought the Freshwater Lab into being and has enabled me to work with incredible community partners as well as grad students, and to do my very best to have, some kind of reciprocal payment for all the energy and the genius brought to the project. We also have a UIC creative activity grant, and 2 of our undergraduate team members have been supported by the Liberal Arts and Sciences Undergraduate Research Initiative at UIC, as well as the Los Ganos Project. Okay, so then here, we'll be hearing from some team members, but I just want everyone to see our 9-person team. We're actually at 10 now. Sorry, his picture's not here yet. We have another team member who is a master's student in creative writing in the UIC English department, Alexander Garza. But here is some of our 9 team members whom you'll be hearing from today. And what I want to say about the team, as well as just speaking gratitude and how brilliant everyone is, when I was listening to the Amy Lowell Letters Project, I was just struck by different processes. I would say that our style, and others can chime in, but I would say that our style of realizing the project does have an improvisational quality to it. In other words, we gathered, and I'll give you a little insight into how that happened, but more than anything, I think it was something like magic of how we coalesced to do this. But we joined together as a team with weekly meetings and subgroups, but the engagement really was, what do you want to say about this body of water? And what are your talents? And so we didn't have mapped out at the beginning what was going to be. And this, Justin will speak after me, and I just want to credit Justin, who built the site, with being able to just roll with this improvisational approach, because it kind of like a lot of brainstorming. And we would just have ideas and then think, do we have the skills to make this possible? And Justin, and now Alexander, who's working on the site, like, they're just the right people to kind of creatively roll with this. So what I want to say as well is that, okay, this is working out. So I thought at the beginning of this project that the methodology, the research would look a lot like Freshwater Stories. I thought we'd have research events and workshops all with communities all along the Chicago area waterway system. Why can't I remember the name, right? When you get research approval to work with human subjects, it's completely escaping me, the name of it.
IRB?
Yes, IRB, all in line in order to speak with different community members and have them work with us as co-authors. But of course, the pandemic hit. And so the team, the 9 of us, really came together, and we thought about how to bring in community leaders to inform us, but how to do research in order to layer these different experiences of the river. And I won't speak too specifically to these. We can bring it up in the Q&A, but I just want to show the different parts, because we have what we're calling 2 formal chapters about this waterway system. And it was in Janet's introduction, but I want to emphasize again that this is the world's most engineered waterway, right? This is something that at the turn of the 20th century, this is a river that was wholly engineered in order to serve the desire, the needs for a metropolis to offshore its waste to the global south, and also to really pave the way for the trading of commodities, which I'll just say briefly in our own time are almost entirely petrochemicals. So this is a very wrought body of water. It's also one that is currently contested, not only through the zoning of Chicago's industrial corridors, but also this is a site on the south branch of the river where grassroots community groups shut down coal power plants and articulated plans that reflected the desires of community, what community members in places like Pilsen, neighborhoods like Pilsen and Little Village wanted to see, which were clean energy hubs, food startup centers, and what these communities are getting at present are large warehouses to back up last mile delivery for Target and Amazon. So this is a very contested waterway. We also have Chicago's mega developments of condos that are being publicly funded right on this waterway. There's a lot to say, but there is high drama transpiring along the Chicago area waterway system. So something that the digital format also gives us is a way to try to intervene in some of these contests and in some of these dramas. So we're doing analysis. We are practicing, we're practicing like critical representation, environmental humanities. But there's a way in which we're also trying to bring an environmental justice approach to these conflicts, which are transpiring in real time. And so I'll let the others speak to some of the specifics, especially the podcasts that we have on here. But just to say something about these two chapters, The River Speaks, to begin, brings the notion from literary scholar Rob Nixon's work of slow violence. And it looks to chart how slow violence occurs and has occurred along this waterway. So the text here amplifies ideas of slow violence. And then thanks to our team member, Tristan Ortiz, working in conjunction with Anish Taylor, Tristan turns 6 branches of the Chicago River into characters. He studied with the help of our whole team, did research about these branches, and then wrote scripts and commissioned 6 Chicago-based performers and activists in order to voice The River Speaks. So maybe at the end we'll have some time and we can play you these vignettes, which really illustrate and bring the river to life, as well as its contradictions. So this page, The River Speaks, is our slow violence page. And our next chapter, The Chicago River is a Pipeline, really interacts in many ways with The River Speaks. But if The River Speaks is showing slow violence and the environmental injustices that transpire along the Chicago River, as well as creative ways of thinking about it, the Chicago River is a Pipeline, really zeroes in on how this body of water has been pressed into the service of the fossil fuel industry, how the Army Corps of Engineers, through fossil fuel exchange, has made itself sovereign over these waters, and the degree to which that sovereignty of an American military division really does conflict with legal and social principles of the public trust, in which the public is supposed to have a say and a stake in its collective water. So I'm going to stop there, and I will stop my share unless Justin still wants it up. And I'm going to turn next to the webmaster behind the Backward River, Justin Radin.
Thanks, Rachel. I'll probably keep my comments super quick and can maybe address things in Q&A if people have questions for me. But I mostly just sort of want to do what I felt was my job all along, which is sort of get out of the way of the very brilliant collaborators that I got to work with on this project. And I'll just sort of give some background into how I got involved, I guess, and what I was doing. So I guess around this time last year, I think, Rachel sort of got in touch with this really cool idea for a kind of, at the time, was going to be conceived more as a sort of digital, an electronic book that was going to sort of tackle all these issues around the Chicago waterways. And there were kind of a series of sort of imagined chapters and a group of potential collaborators. And so we just started talking about how we might do a project like this, and eventually decided okay, maybe something like an electronic book, while it has all these sort of multimedia capacities, might not be the best thing for us, because what you really want is this kind of living thing, that's as Rachel was just describing, there are sort of planned portions of this project that are in the process of being both kind of conceived and worked out and developed, and so that this will be a sort of ongoing project. you know, that was sort of like the one idea I had to contribute. And then we just sort of spent the summer kind of doing these, as Rachel said, almost sort of improvised, collaborative meetings about like, okay, what can we do? How can we sort of communicate this incredible wealth of knowledge and expertise that all these people are bringing to this project, all these ideas for sort of multimedia components. And I would sort of like sit in the meeting and nod and sometimes like lie and say like, oh yeah, I can definitely do that. And then sort of run away and scramble and try to figure out how I would do that. I should also say that Janet has been like a huge ally in this project too, because you know, we wouldn't have been able to put any of this together without her help, and also without her sort of like incredibly rapid email response, which in pandemic times is not nothing. So yeah, I mean, my job was to just sort of build out this WordPress site. If people have sort of questions about WordPress and like how to use it in the Q&A, I can do that, but I won't kind of bore you with those details at this point, except to say that it's a good CMS. It's fairly idiot-proof. I'm not like an expert in CMS technologies, or like I'm not like a sort of high functioning computer person, and was able to do this with relatively little learning curve, and had a lot of help also from Erica. So yeah, I'll sort of leave it at that, and I'll turn it over to my collaborators who really did all of the intellectual work here and put the content together that is incredible. So.
Thanks, Justin. Hi, everyone. My name is Erica Chavez. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications for the College of Applied Health Sciences here at UIC. I'm also a proud member of the Freshwater Lab. I was recruited by Rachel. I don't know if that's the correct word, but I've always been a lifelong learner and was interested in the Freshwater Lab, and as a staff member decided to enroll in one of Rachel's courses. And I've been hooked ever since, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to work with her and this amazing team and make contributions where I can. When I think about my role in this particular project, I think it's very much aligned with what I do in my professional capacity or for my day job. So a lot of what I was doing was really trying to distill a lot of the conversation that was happening amongst the contributors and the team, especially during the nascent stage where we were trying to really align this project with our intentions and our goals. Because we're looking at the Chicago waterway system, we really had an opportunity to just go in various directions. But like Rachel said, we wanted to center communities. We wanted to highlight the bonds of the source, of our water source that we all share. And we really wanted to heighten the fact that although it is one waterway system, one river in this particular project, the experiences of individuals really vary in terms of how they interface, access, interact with this particular body, depending on where in the city they might be. And so I felt like I was one of those people that always kind of kept pulling back in terms of the conversation and recentering around, okay, what is it that we really want to amplify or communicate with this particular project? And how does it align with what we told or what Rachel told our funders, supporters, and collaborators? Because that's one thing to also keep in mind, and it's very important, is that especially when you have a funding source, an external funding source, or several funding sources, it's important that the project have some checkpoints or milestones in which you are kind of testing against what you told your funders perhaps you wanted to do or wanted to accomplish with this project. And through that process, perhaps something might not fit within the scope of the intended project or the original project, but it can serve as an opportunity to perhaps be an extension or expand on the project once it's in a state where you present it publicly. And that's where we're at right now, as Rachel mentioned. Another thing I think that is important when we think about any kind of project is branding and communications and marketing around it, right? I think a lot of what happens with academic projects, higher education projects, research-based projects is that we tend to create these projects for our peers or for them to live within these institutions. One of the things that was very, very clear to us is that we wanted this project to be accessible and to speak to all of the members of our communities and the residents of the city of Chicago. So that meant thinking about our language, thinking about our grammar, thinking about who we're inviting to be our collaborators and partners, whose voices we're amplifying and elevating, so that we can be equitable and accessible and represent ourselves as an extension of the individuals and neighborhoods and communities that we're trying to represent and highlight within this project. So again, that kind of goes into centering our scope and kind of creating a framework, helping it strengthen the framework that was laid out for this project. One of the other things I would recommend is that you really think about strategically as you're thinking about the content and contributions and goals of the project, that you incorporate marketing and communications as well, because we don't want this project or any of our projects to die within our institutions. And so that requires, creating a social media strategy, creating branding and visual assets, creating kind of like elevator pitches for your team members so that they're able to talk about this project in 30, 60-minute clips for individuals. And so I think that component, that aspect of centering the project, providing action items and actionable items for the team to kind of move forward through, and also think about marketing and communications as an integral part of any project from the very beginning is important for this project and for any project. So I'll pass it on to, I think it was Becky, who's next? Yes.
Awesome. So yeah, thank you for having us. I was thinking about like, what can I add? Everyone's done such a great job adding pieces. So I think that something that was really unique about this project, one is just, during the pandemic dealing with this, right? And something that I appreciated so much was the flexibility we had. And as Rachel said, the improvisation of how this came together. As a planner, for me and someone who is kind of more tangible, the brainstorming phase is not usually my area of expertise, because I'm like, okay, what are the steps? Let's do the things. And that first very open-ended thing of like, we can do anything is tough for me. So what I appreciated kind of that process. And yeah, I also kind of took classes with Rachel. I was her grad student last spring. And it was like, hey, let's stay on for this project. I'm so in for this. Very excited to have something on my schedule after I graduated last May. But a big, thing, we're starting this project and then the uprisings started. And that was just for everybody, right? Like such an emotional and challenging time. And it was really special and appreciated that we had these like meetings, and those first few weeks we didn't even really talk that much about the river, because it was just like, what do people need right now? And so we were just kind of processing our feelings, and then we'd like spend a few minutes and kind of approach like, okay, what is doable, what feels like something that you could talk about right now. And so that slow process was needed during this time, and also I think made it more comfortable personally for me and for us to just like have these very open conversations, not have these strict deadlines right from the beginning. We kind of group off into teams based on, oh, okay, like Anisha and I were interested in industrial corridor, so we had a couple meetings talking about this. Other people are interested in the river as a pipeline. They had a couple meetings about that. And then we kind of come back together and see how things were meshing. And that was a really, I think, important part of the process of us kind of having a lot of those dialogues and then slowly like pulling those pieces. Yeah, people like Erica and Rachel kind of pulling them into something that could become a thing. And that was really interesting. And then I think also the way that we have such a diverse team, undergrads, grad students, working people, and so many different perspectives. So again, like I'm a planner, and so I have a different kind of angle on things. And we've got creative people, we've got science, Lally is our science expert. And so that was also really interesting to work together. We were kind of putting together all this data and like talking about slow violence and how could we make this into a thing. And then suddenly we're making these audio pieces that are this beautiful, like creative piece about the river. And that's not something that I could have done like with my data pieces. And so it was really special to have all these different layers going on. I think that that really makes this such an awesome project, is having those different brains and those different specialties coming together. And then something else I'll just add about organization is like we started so flexibly that at some point we realized, okay, we got to start like now getting an organization system going. I remember a meeting, we were sharing documents, like people started writing things and we're sharing different documents. And I was like, are these documents in our Google Drive? Like what's happening? And so then once we started getting to more formal ideas, we're like, okay, let's get an organization system in place. And so then we actually started using really just Google Drive was what we used for everything to just, and as we were going along, we were just building out new folders and chapters and using that as the main way to virtually collaborate and just make sure we were kind of all on the same page and had all our stuff in one place. So we'll pass it on to Anish to add some more layers on top.
Hey everybody, thanks for having me. My name's Anish Taylor. I'm a Master's of Urban Planning recent graduate. I think everybody's said so many good things about the project. I think one thing that I can add is that from my perspective, the purpose was always to create an emotional connection to the river for the listener of the audio pieces. And this is something that I kind of gleaned from an interview with Santiago X, which is on one of our podcasts, episode 2 of Freshwater Radio. He's an indigenous futurist artist, and he creates art that tries to build a connection between humans and the natural environment around them, because from an indigenous perspective, they had emotional bonds with bodies of water, land formations, animals. And in our cities today, we have detached from that connection. And so when I was thinking about the characters in The River Speaks, I was centering the emotion, what can we do to create an emotional bond to the river so that people who listen to it speak will feel connected to it and thereby want to take care of it and appreciate it and maybe demand more from elected officials to protect it. And so in centering the emotion, I think that's something unique. I've never really worked on a project before that explicitly centered emotions. And I think that made it really nice to work in. And also when we were explaining the project to outside people, it resonated. Anytime I was speaking about it with a colleague or a classmate or on job interviews, and when I was casting the Backward River, the actors themselves also really resonated, and I could feel it, in the moment, talking to somebody about it, that it made an impact. And so it's just a recommendation I have, is to find the emotion, center it, uplift it, and build a project around that. And that's something that we did, and I think it turned out really, really well for a team member's perspective and for viewers' perspective.
One other thing I'd like to add, again, just along this thing of not letting projects die within our own institutions and within our own kind of like bubbles, is that we were very intentional and very clear that we also wanted individuals to, just like we want team members to leave our team with a clear sense of what their next steps would be in between our next meeting, we wanted to give individuals who are visiting our site or consuming parts of our project an opportunity to leave something or contribute something to the project on their own. And so it was very important to us to create a toolkit that it's on our website. And that toolkit provides individuals with very clear, concise, actionable steps in which they can become part of the Backward project themselves, or the Backward River project themselves. And so I think that, again, making people feel like they have a role and giving them different ways in which to get involved, whether we know it or not. Ideally, we'd like to know about it. And so I think part of it is building in a feedback loop in which you allow individuals to then communicate back how they connect with the project, is another important piece. So the toolkit was very important to us. Also, part of what we've been doing as part of this digital project is an event series that highlights the different areas and themes within our project, and allows individuals to expound on what we presented in a different format. So again, just creating and thinking about ways in which people can interact with your particular project beyond its digital format and in its current offering.
Great. Was there anything else from the team that you wanted to say before we start taking questions?
No, that is our overview, and yeah, we welcome questions and comments, and then maybe in our remaining time together, we'll also find a way to pick one of the 6 branches, and we could even at some point listen to one of the vignettes. Maybe we'll do a poll in the chat. People can vote for which branch they want to hear from while we're all together.
Yes, that would be great. So while we wait though for some questions in the chat, could you talk a little bit about how you manage the project in terms of like how responsibilities and tasks were divided? Because I think it's really interesting that you have such a varied, expertise. So I think that'd be interesting for people to hear.
Yeah, I want to start by saying, and really thanks also to the Lowell Letters team who spoke earlier for bringing up a lot of these issues about labor and payments and, graduate student exploitation. So yeah, I'll say in that, I feel comfortable asking people to do specific things when they're being paid. So when I have, and the Freshwater Lab worked with a consultant, Dr. Antonio Lopez, in order to develop an ethical framework for its work, both internal to UIC, how to work with students, but importantly, how to ethically structure partnerships with community groups that are very important to us. So we really are, academics and intellectuals and artists, but we're trying to, as exactly as Erica said, to center community views in our work. And so among those principles that the Freshwater Lab developed with Dr. Lopez was this notion of paying people, and that, to be really frank, it puts, I think, good pressure on me, to kind of go out and get the money to pay people. So if someone's, being paid for their time, then we can say things like, Justin, will you go figure out how to make this happen on WordPress? Or, Anish and Becky, when they're paid, planners, can you please help us, organize the context of our creative brainstorming? So, you know, that's a principle where I feel comfortable and the team feels comfortable when someone's being paid, asking them to do something specific. When there isn't payments involved, then it really does become a, you know, a contribute as you want to. You know, so especially for our undergraduate members, they've gotten a little payment out of this here and there. It of course doesn't quite compensate for their full contributions, but you know, there I think it's very important that anything created gives attribution, highlights their brilliance, you know, and is something that they can use. So, you know, and there, especially when Becky graduated and cycled off the payment team, you know, it sort of became, well, you know, what do you want to do? What do you want to use as a portfolio piece? Or what, you know, how do you want to intervene in these conversations? And so, for example, Becky drew that map on the River Speaks of the Chicago area waterway system because we discovered there was no map that emplaced the various branches of the river in neighborhoods. And we were talking about the scale of neighborhood, the scale of community, but we had no visual representation that accounted for that. You know, so that's something that Becky went and did, but it's again, it's really important, especially if someone is not being remunerated, that they've got a sense of ownership and they think, I want to do it. And so it's again that we keep using the word, but it's really right, the improvisational kind of dialogues that we had. And you know, we didn't actually like kind of come up with a method for our dialogues, I'm realizing, but I think this was the pandemic and the intensity of the uprising that I feel like everyone was very honest and direct. And I hope I'm not you know, an out of touch professor here, but you know, I hope correctly that when people say like, that's too much, I don't want to do it, you know, that they can. Or if they say like, you know, in one cases, again, like the River Speaks, one of our undergraduate team members, Tristan Ortiz, was kind of burning to do this. You know, he's an aspiring filmmaker. And so it sort of became, let's make it happen. And then we realized that we should really have actors be the voices. And so then we had to go and, you know, figure out how to pay them. And as Anish could tell you, like ad nauseum, you hit all kinds of things there. Like if someone's an employee of UIC, you can't pay them. And so, you know, Anish sometimes found himself like shopping for office furniture as a way to pay one of our actors for voicing the river. So yeah, I think if I'm going to like put a spin on it, because my own experience of it isn't that it's chaotic, but you know, I sort of, you know, think about something like you know, like the cellular nature of a tree or the way water, you know, moves across space, that we are able with the moving parts, I think, and I try to be very grounded in those ethical principles. And I also feel a lot of gratitude personally and collectively. I feel a lot of gratitude that our team members, I think, do a really good job of, you know, if we are going to have an ethical lapse or we have a problematic ask of a community member, I think that we're all very good at keeping each other cognizant of just, you know, no, it's not perfect by any means. But, you know, just again and again, and Erica is in particular very good at this. It's just like recentering our commitments to community and to environmental justice, you know, and we're not always going to get it right, but really trying to have that. So it's, I would say, more than a grand organizational vision, and with much thanks to the planners in our group, I think we really have tried to, you know, really be rooted in these principles.
Great, thank you. We do have another question here. What are the drawbacks of managing a large project, not only specific to this project, but in general? And what are your strategies to overcome?
Yeah, does someone else want to take it on? Justin or Anish or Erica? I just want to make room for the large project if any of you have thoughts. Becky, anybody want to chime in on this one?
I can jump in really quick. I mean, I was thinking about this morning, listening to the first project on the Lowell letters, which was fascinating. And I was trying to think about the ways in which our two projects are kind of obviously very different, which maybe makes this a sort of beneficial sort of collision or something like that. So, you know, managing a project like Melissa's, it seems like you have to be, and hopefully I'm not mischaracterizing this, but you have to be very sort of like diligent and strategic in your sort of timetable. You have this sort of objective to digitize these materials, and you have, you know, X amount of funding, X amount of time, or whatever. I think one of the maybe the things that we that felt like a belly flop for us maybe was that because we had this kind of, we had the opportunity to do this sort of really not, we didn't have to be super strict about our approach to this. We were very, like, people were, and also to sort of address the previous question, like, everybody had their skills, but everybody was also sort of doing everything all the time, partly because people wanted to be involved in the project in these different ways. So we just sort of got to a point where we realized, like, oh, we do actually have a kind of, you know, there will be a point where we need to present this material. And so now we need to be a little bit more strategic about, like, putting together a strict timetable, which is maybe, you know, it's hard to say at the end of the day, like, should we have tried to do that earlier? Was it better to, like, let things stay kind of amorphous early on because we didn't really know what shape the project was going to take? This is probably not a very helpful answer. It's just to say that, like, there was a point where we realized we had to sort of kind of implement a stricter schedule and timetable for the project.
And I can add, from working on this team, I think is smaller than some others I've worked on in work or voluntary settings. I think one of the big issues with larger teams is, like, that you can't always all get in the same room. Like Justin said, we could be there all together and kind of come together and, like, have those conversations and then figure out how to move forward in our big group meetings, because it wasn't that big of a group. And when you get larger, that gets much harder, right? It's just like, it's harder to have these conversations all together. The larger the group gets, the more specialized people get too as well. So I think then those lines of communication and communication systems need to be a lot more clear and, like, set in stone more, or, like, talked about more when you get with a bigger team, right? Because maybe everyone who's working on the social media can't get all together to be at this big meeting. So you need to make sure you have someone passing the information off. So I think, we have kind of like a nice size that we could mostly be all in one room. And that was made it work for something so open-ended. But you really need to kind of get clearer about communication as you get to a bigger team. And then I think also centering the message becomes harder as you get to larger and more specialized teams as well. And that's something to keep in mind and keep doing in the smaller, like, offshoot meetings as you get into bigger teams.
Great, thanks. So I have a question here from Mark Canuel. I'm wondering if they would like to build on Missy's comments on what universities, departments, libraries, humanities institutes, etc., can do to help foster digital projects. What kinds of support would be helpful?
It's a great question and very strategic. I mean, I have to say directly to you, Janet, the fact that you've been there for us, and I remember Justin's first meeting with you almost a year ago, and the kind of excitement that there is this support. So I think the Digital Humanities Initiative is a big step forward for that. this might not be interesting to many of the people here, but coming back to, to this issue of payment and, not something that I learned in developing community partnerships with environmental justice groups is people get asked a lot, especially now with Black Lives Matter, with some attention being paid to underrepresentation. So it means, you've got people who are asked a lot. Well, you come to this panel, can we interview you? One of our partners for this was the American Indian Center, for example, and they're asked all the time, right, to be that Indigenous voice, to be that Indigenous group. And so I feel happy how the partnership transpired. I spoke with the former education director at the American Indian Center, Fawn Pochel, and I said, we really want to have a water acknowledgement, and we want to learn about the Indigenous roots of this river, but also contemporary conceptions, right? We say pretty provocatively, the Chicago River is a pipeline. But, we wanted to have other socioeconomic views that are different from that. Well, the American Indian Center, as I said, gets asked all the time. And so ultimately, a team member who's not here, Kathleen Blackburn, and I had quite a few dialogues with Fawn, and we ended up hiring a research assistant, a UIC student, together. And so, okay, so what do I want to say about how this could be made institutionally easier? It's not really in the wheelhouse of universities to recognize this kind of community labor. And so and I mean, again, and Anish can really speak to this, because like every stipend, you really have to have money for a grad student, because otherwise you never get your research done, you just be paying stipends. So, we have to get, especially UIC, but in general, if universities state that they've got a community-based, a public mission, we've got to find a way to make these relationships easier, and also for our students, to open the practical knowledge of what people are doing in community and in leadership, right? That's a form of teaching and learning. And, to have a project, as we, continue to strive to be, as Erica said, that speaks to community members, that tries a fair representation of their experiences, we don't have the institutional setup. Like every single one of these partnerships, it's like pulling teeth, and it requires a lot of apology. Like I have to say to people, I'm so sorry, like, especially with the pandemic. And, like, I know you might not be able to pay your rent this month, but it's still going to take UIC 3 months to get you paid if it happens. So I think that, if the digital, right, there's a lot of reasons, there's a lot of justifications for the digital form. I mean, its speed is one thing. When you've got these warehouses going in, and just really what's happening right now in the city of Chicago is almost like a retrenchment of forms of environmental racism. Something that had like pre-industrial iterations, industrial iterations, post-industrial iterations. We're now like in the Anthropocene, like reiteration of these forms of environmental racism. So the fact that we could start brainstorming this in May 2020 and launch December 1st, as an academic, I appreciate the speed, because a peer-reviewed thing, like, it just would take much longer. So I appreciate the speed. I appreciate that you can try to disseminate it widely, but really, I see it, I hope these digital storytelling spaces are ultimately kind of in the service of, let me say, like a kind of watershed politic, that new bonds are created, that we see that if you have certain stretches of the quote unquote Chicago River that do not have to meet water quality standards because they've been designated environmental corridors, there's like at least two things to realize there. One is how where those corridors are corresponds with race. And two, like, who is best served? Because the whole thing is going to flood. And so who is best served when all of these toxic chemicals come back on us all? So there's really like, there's a desire to create, new bonds, new encounters, new solidarities using this digital format. That's another way I see it as like special and useful, but that it's exciting because it can be quite interdisciplinary. And I think that's another thing where these digital humanities initiatives and institutes at the university, can keep inflecting that interdisciplinary. I'd love to get more scientists on this project. I'd love to think about data visualization. The way it stands, yeah, anyway, we could talk about that. But, I'd love to actually like get some data visualization in the service of like environmental protection. So I think that the interdisciplinary piece is really, really exciting, but we've got to bring more intention, and we've got to, I think, be a little bit more hard-nosed with the administration, that if we're going to talk about being an urban public serving university, we just have to structure how to do these partnerships much better.
That's great. I'd like to just add one more thing, and this has to do with, centering this being human-centered, being the humanities. I think accessibility is very important to think about as you integrate different components and pieces to a project, a multidimensional project. For me, what that means is making sure that we're thinking about audiences' abilities, whether that's visual, hearing, so on and so forth, and also language. And so there would be more resources to provide to teams and projects around. These are the things that you should consider when it comes to accessibility, like visual impairment, hearing impairment. What should be the basics that should be integrated in any digital, project to meet kind of like the bare minimum requirements? UIC has a really great Center on Disabilities. It has a couple of offices that center around disabilities. So I think perhaps creating partnerships where resources and reference materials are created and provided for individuals who are participating in projects, so that they can start thinking about those things as they're creating their projects and not so much as an afterthought. And translation and transcribing services as well, I think is something that's very important to provide. And those things are costly too. So just thinking about accessibility, equity, centering projects like these around equity is something that I would say is important and should be considered and available to everyone.
Thanks, Erica. That's a really good point, and I'm taking note of that, because I have done presentation, like workshops on website accessibility and like best practices. So I think definitely that's something the library could do exactly what you're describing, like just the basics, what you should know. I have another question here, kind of related to what you were just talking about. I'm curious about how you chose WordPress as your content management site. Were there other platforms you considered apart from WordPress?
Do you want me to take that, Rachel? Yeah. So at first we were looking at the the UI's digital publishing initiative, which Janet also put together. It's kind of impossible. Like, I can't overstate the sort of fundamental infrastructure like that we owe to Janet. And like, this project wouldn't have happened in any way, shape, or form if not for these projects that Janet's been working on, both at UI and then at UIC, because we ended up doing it with the Digital Humanities Initiative. When we decided to sort of do it as a CMS, as a website, I think it was, we looked at like Grav and Omeka and the other things on offer. I think it was kind of almost automatic though to select WordPress. One, as Erica was saying in the chat, that all the UIC web pages are built off of a custom WordPress thing. So like specifically to address the problem of, having different students sort of work on the project, the learning curve would be lower. And also they might be able to navigate into other sort of CMS management roles in the university or whatever. And then also the Freshwater Lab site is a WordPress site. So ideally, Rachel would be able to have somebody who could sort of manage both at the same time without having to learn two different systems. So that's basically the reason why we did it. And it's probably the easiest to learn. I don't know, maybe that's not true, but it seems like.
And related to that, so this is kind of the second part of this question. I am also curious about how you will be preserving the site and keep it updated with new tech developments after people leave or graduate from UIC.
Okay, so again, thanks to Janet, who, the digital humanities created a digital repository for freshwater stories and the Backward River. And as we decided last week, and I'll use the language from our own meeting, the band is staying together. And we are, we are not ready to stop with this project. So we continue to meet. In fact, Anish and Becky have graduated, but are still on the team. So, we just, again, like center people's schedules and what they're willing to give. But yeah, we're still in the process of updating this. And we'll be doing that all through the summer. And and then in terms of like new tech developments, right, it means that, Justin has to also finish his dissertation. So, we need to like keep finding people. I mean, really, the improvisational piece will continue just by nature. But I am excited to give everyone here a little preview. We are also planning like an outdoor live arts and activism festival. I think we've got an okay from all our partners. It will be the Backward River Festival. So we are planning, both a kind of a release event and a way of gathering in more information that will be on the river outside on October 16th and 17th. And it's exciting because we also have colleagues and graduate students in art and art history involved. So, we do have this other kind of growing aspect of our team. And so I think our plan is at the festival and at our through our event series, we're also going to be building new partnerships and building new aspects of the website. And so the question is good, like, how are you going to do it and who's going to build the tech? Well, maybe that will be an outcome of this meeting. It will become clear, but but we're just continuing to go. And as I said, I hope that the funding comes through to keep this project going to the Calumet, the Des Plaines River, the Illinois. And I've been making some connections with colleagues in Springfield. But I'll again give kind of a preview. We're here in the Chicago area. It's urban. We're very focused on environmental justice. But I really think that if we're taking the watershed seriously, that this kind of project of digital storytelling and collaborative cartography, I see it that it could be very powerfully a way of connecting with rural communities and kind of exploring, the water issues that are transpiring in these connected watersheds, with our environmental justice point of view. So, very much hoping to both locate the technologies, but also to, really think about what not on quite the city level, but definitely on the state and national level, these kind of like rural urban divides and how severe they are and how it seems like they're getting deepened by who will and won't be vaccinated. So the kind of test case of the watershed, which does actually bridge these communities, you know, can we kind of map a social reflex of the way that water connects such disparate communities? So, you know, that's not quite a tech question. I guess my own answer to that is, please, oh person with the abilities, manifest yourself. I'll try to conjure the person, but on like the kind of social technologies, I feel like we have to kind of figure out a way to speak to each other across these deepening divides. And my wager is that shared water might be the way to do it.
Great, thanks. I have a question that came through the chat for Becky, because you mentioned communication. Like, what are some ways the team ensured against breakdowns of communication between everybody?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I mean, one was just a lot of conversations, for sure. Like I said, we had those weekly meetings and it was very flexible. If you couldn't make them, we can kind of catch people up. And then we'd have little offshoot meetings about people working on different projects, or different pieces. And so we always made sure to recap what was happening in kind of the offshoot meetings when we had the main meetings. I think that was a big part of it, to make sure everyone was kind of in the know on what all these other pieces are. Like, especially right now with the events, all of us are not planning each event. So there's kind of teams doing that. And then in our main meetings, we sort of recap where that's at, get feedback from people so that we're all still going in the same direction. And then we also use the comments and like tagging features in Google Documents a lot. And that seems to work really well for the website. That was huge. It was like, and for like tasks and getting done is like tagging who needs to do different things or respond to different things so we can get stuff done. So yeah, that feature was huge, especially as people like couldn't make a meeting or whatever, we can get things accomplished between meetings using those features of like, okay, tag Rachel and Erica to get feedback on this before we make this change on the website or whatever. And then we do have a lot of email threads that can get a little challenging, a lot of different email threads going about different pieces. So sometimes that can be a little tough to keep track of. But yeah, you definitely need a combo, right? Of like the in-person stuff, figuring out what things you need to talk about. That's a big thing. Sometimes we can get like caught up in getting excited about something. And then we're like, okay, let's make sure we bring it back and also get to these more urgent questions or like more timely things or things that we know we want to talk about as a group versus what stuff can be done in a smaller meeting.
Great, thanks. And then I have one more question here in the chat, not in the Q&A, but from the chat. Your project is such a beautiful and useful tool for the community and for students. I was wondering if you had any plans to integrate community conversations about shifting wildlife patterns in or around the river. I've heard several recent conversations on NPR, I think, about other populations on the Chicago River that seem to bring in a lot of community response / photo sharing.
Okay, it's a great question. Maybe I'll start here. Again, our team member, Kathleen Blackburn, isn't able to be here with a dissertation defense soon on her tails, but yeah, you might start to wonder, like, do we only do all the really gross stuff? But we did focus on one species that has really captured the world's attention, which is the so-called Asian carp. And you know, we did quite a lot of work about this paradoxical invisibility of oil on the Chicago River. You know, like the barges are filled with petrochemicals, the public subsidizes their way. You know, just You know, you kind of go down the South Branch, the oil infrastructure is so present, but hides in plain sight. So, you know, we spent a lot of time on the paradoxical optics of no one seeing the fossil fuel infrastructure, but this like huge focus on these species of carp that have been labeled invaders and have therefore cued the Army Corps of Engineers to assert its sovereignty. And so the carp, especially the silver carp, which jump out of the water when there are propellers from boats. So, you know, it's become this kind of like charismatic species that, you know, that holds up into it. And we get into this in depth in the Chicago River is a pipeline. But, you know, the carp like encodes this nativistic response of Midwesterners, you know, and its label is Asian, you know, kind of like encodes this strange post-industrial xenophobia where the problems of disappearing and decaying industry is the problem of somehow like Asian manufacture, or of course, you know, the rhetoric we've been seeing around the coronavirus. So like the specter of the carp and all of the kind of public rhetoric around bracing ourselves for this proposed invasion, while at the same time ignoring the fact that these are just fish traveling around channels cut for shipping and commodity exchange. But nobody looks at that. It's all about somehow, you know, building what I call the carp checkpoint in the Des Plaines River. And there's just been close to $1 billion federal appropriation, you know, to somehow like create, and it really, I've done a lot of research in Palestine, and like, I am so struck by how the carp checkpoint like resembles things that I have passed through in the infrastructure of occupation. So, okay, that wasn't the question, but we spend a lot of time with this species, you know, because of how talk and response to the species really does shape policy and infrastructure around the Chicago River. Yes, other wildlife and bringing in these other species, it's something that we've talked about. And we, as I said, we've got colleagues in art and art history who are joining in for different phases of the project. One of those colleagues, Beate Geisler, did get hold of a wildlife camera and set it up last summer. So we did think we might have this film of other species interacting with the river, but you know, as art projects go, I think the camera got flooded out. So yeah, we are interested in that, but also deferring to other colleagues. Someone in anthropology who's been on sabbatical talked about connecting us with bird watchers, you know, and how there also is this like these aerial migrations. So that is to say, it's a great question because, you know, layering other species, you know, along with our humanistic engagement, it definitely is a wish, and maybe we'd all like to, you know, get some new fish besides the carp in our lives, but they've proven to be quite a rich site of inquiry.
Great, thanks. So we have, I think we should probably be wrapping up. We're just about at the end here. But thank you so much to everyone on this team for telling us more about the project and giving us a preview of the site and everything. And I'm going to turn it over to Carla, who has some closing remarks.
Thanks, Janet, and thanks to all of you. So yeah, we're going to wrap it up. It's almost noon. Thank you again to the Amy Lowell Letters Project and the Freshwater Lab. You are all fabulous today. We appreciate you. A quick shout out to Paige Wynn, our colleague in Creative and Digital Services, who dealt with the technical side of setting up this event, and Tina Dillon, our captioner. Thank you. And thanks to all of you out in Zoom land. If you have questions or comments about today's events, you can contact me or Janet through the DHI site. And that's it. Everybody have a great day. Have a great spring. Have a great rest of the semester or quarter, whatever you're in. And see you in the fall.
Thank you so much.